When God prepares to bless a woman greatly, the shift does not begin with thunder or lightning. It begins with a divine stirring so subtle that she may not even recognize it at first. Heaven begins to move in her direction long before anything around her changes. God starts by awakening something inside her, a hunger, a restlessness, a fire that refuses to be silent. It is the quiet announcement that her life is about to expand beyond anything she has ever imagined. God blesses a woman by transforming her before transforming her circumstances. He begins touching the secret corners of her mind where doubts have lived too long. He starts dismantling old fears that have disguised themselves as wisdom. He challenges the inner dialogue that tells her she is not enough. He begins to whisper truths that contradict every lie she has ever believed. And though the world may see no evidence of change yet, heaven knows that her transformation has already begun. The most powerful shift happens within her before it ever happens around her. When God prepares to bless a woman greatly, he isolates her, not to punish her, but to refine her. He removes distractions so she can hear him clearly. He separates her from environments that keep her small. He disconnects her from relationships that drain her identity. He pulls her away from noise so he can speak purpose over her destiny. What feels like loneliness is actually God clearing the stage for revelation. He is not taking people from her. He is making room for what he is adding to her. A woman who feels abandoned is often a woman God is preparing to announce God will also allow pressure to develop her capacity. Great blessings require great strength, and strength is built in the unseen battles of the soul. She may walk through seasons that force her to confront who she is when no one applauds. She may endure trials that make her question if she is equipped. She may face obstacles that seem impossible to climb. But what she cannot see is that these very moments are stretching her for the blessing ahead. The weight that tried to break her is building the muscle she will need to carry greatness. Every tear has been collected. Every battle has become training. It is wasted. God also refines her vision. He begins revealing dreams she once buried. He opens her eyes to possibilities she was afraid to imagine. He enlarges her expectation. He stirs purpose in her spirit until she cannot fit into the life she once settled for. What once satisfied her no longer does. What once felt comfortable now feels too small. She is being prepared for elevation. She is being shaped for influence. What God is about to pour into her requires her to see beyond her present limitations. A woman whose vision grows is a woman whose future is being built by God himself. When God prepares to bless a woman greatly, he restores her voice, the voice that pain muted, the voice that fear silenced, the voice that doubt weakened. He strengthens her inner language until she speaks with conviction instead of insecurity. He teaches her to prophesy over her own life, to declare what he has spoken, even when her surroundings disagree. Her words begin to rise. Her confidence returns. She becomes aligned with the truth of who God says she is, not who life tried to convince her she was. And then, in God's perfect timing, the blessing manifests. Not because she chased it, but because she became the woman capable of carrying it. Her character has been shaped. Her faith has matured. Her courage has awakened. She is no longer the version of herself that settled for less. She becomes the woman heaven has been preparing. When God blesses a woman greatly, the world often sees the outcome, but heaven knows the process. She is not blessed because she was lucky. She is blessed because she survived the refining. She endured the stretching. She embraced the transformation. She allowed God to build her from the inside out, and now everything that was once withheld is being released. The blessing is not just coming to her, it is coming through her. When God begins preparing to bless a woman greatly, the process rarely announces itself with trumpets or grand displays. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a whisper drifting through the chambers of the soul. A whisper is subtle, delicate, and easy to miss, yet it is powerful enough to shift a life. This whisper is the first sign that heaven is moving. God does not start his greatest work in the noise of public celebration. He begins in the hidden places where only the woman and God can hear. While the world looks for spotlights, God looks for stillness. He waits for the moment when her heart becomes a sanctuary where he can plant new words, new identity, and new strength. Before a woman is ever promoted, God strengthens her foundation. He will speak to her spirit long before he ever speaks to her situation. His whisper comes to override the old narrative she has lived with for years. The words that told her she was not enough, that she was too broken, too late, or too flawed. The whisper of God interrupts those internal scripts with something gentler yet far more authoritative. It might come as a sudden clarity in the middle of ordinary tasks, or a stirring during prayer, or a quiet conviction that refuses to let her go. The whisper says, "You were made for more." It is God's way of lighting a match in the dark corners of her understanding, revealing that nothing about her story disqualifies her. His purpose. This whisper is not meant to impress her. It is meant to anchor her. God knows that if he blesses a woman publicly before he prepares her privately, the blessing can crush what her character cannot carry. So he whispers to build her inner world. He whispers to heal unseen wounds. He whispers to remind her who she truly is, his daughter, chosen and deeply capable. The whisper is the blueprint of her blessing, the quiet conversation that shapes her identity long before the world sees any evidence of change. It is God's way of taking her hand and leading her into alignment with his vision of her future. Sometimes the whisper comes during moments of weakness, when she feels unqualified or overwhelmed. Instead of chastising her, God leans in and whispers strength into her fear. He whispers courage into her hesitation. He whispers direction into her confusion. The whisper does not raise its voice to compete with the noise of her circumstances. Instead, it invites her to lean closer. It is in the leaning that she grows. God knows that if she learns to recognize him in the whisper, she will never doubt him in the storm. A woman who hears God privately becomes unstoppable when she steps into public arenas, because her confidence is not built on applause. It is built on communion. The whisper also tests her readiness. God watches how she responds when he speaks softly. Will she trust him without seeing the full picture? Will she obey him when the instruction is quiet enough for her to ignore? Will she nurture what he plants in her spirit when no one else knows a seed has been sown? The whisper is a divine invitation requiring faith, patience, and intimacy. It is the proving ground of her destiny. Greatness in God's kingdom always starts with small, quiet beginnings that demand a woman's full attention. God whispers to see if she can steward his voice before he hands her his platform. The whisper is also a shield. Before God exposes a woman to greater influence or visibility, he covers her in a season of hidden development. Hiddenness is not punishment. Hiddenness is protection. It is God's way of forming her away from the opinions, expectations, and distractions that could distort her growth. In the secret place, the whisper becomes her teacher. She learns discernment, resilience, and wisdom. She learns to distinguish God's voice from her fears. She learns to trust his timing when everything in her wants to rush. The whisper cultivates the kind of inner strength the spotlight could never produce.
When God prepares to bless a woman greatly, the whisper is his first brushstroke on the canvas of her transformation. It is how he shapes her thinking, aligns her inner dialogue, and molds her spirit for what she is about to carry.
The spotlight may one day announce her arrival, but the whisper is what makes her ready.
When God sets his hand on a woman's life,
the first place he begins to work is not her circumstances, but her inner dialogue, the conversation she has with herself in the quiet, those unspoken thoughts, the silent meditations, the internal commentary that nobody hears but her. Those are the true architects of her destiny. A woman can have talent, opportunity, and potential, but if her inner dialogue contradicts the truth, God speaks over her, she will shrink from doors that were built for her to walk through. Destiny is not shaped by external noise. Destiny is shaped by internal agreement. The most powerful shifts in a woman's life happen when she starts speaking to herself in alignment with heaven. Every woman carries two voices within her, the echo of her past and the whisper of God's promise. The echo reminds her of rejection, failure, and disappointment. It tells her what she has lost, where she has fallen, and where she fears she may never rise again. But the whisper speaks of calling, identity, and divine purpose. It reminds her of who she truly is beneath the layers of life's weight. Her destiny begins to form the moment she chooses which voice to believe. When her inner dialogue becomes a reflection of God's truth rather than her past pain, the trajectory of her life shifts. Change does not begin with opportunity, it begins with self-perception.
the enemy understands this more than anyone.
He does not waste time attacking her crown when he can attack her confidence. He doesn't focus on blocking her path when he can infiltrate her thoughts. If he can convince a woman to doubt herself, he doesn't need to sabotage anything else. She will begin to sabotage her own purpose. That is why the greatest warfare does not happen in the world around her. It happens in the world within her. Thoughts become beliefs, beliefs become behaviors, and behaviors build a destiny. A woman who talks herself out of her purpose will never become the woman God designed her to be. But a woman who talks herself into alignment with God's plans becomes unstoppable. Inner dialogue is not merely self-talk, it is spiritual architecture. When a woman speaks words of faith to herself, she builds a foundation strong enough to hold the weight of her future. When she tells herself she is capable, she becomes more resilient. When she declares she is chosen, she becomes more focused. When she reminds herself she is loved, she becomes more courageous. Her internal language shapes her identity long before she steps into any platform or calling. God can place a woman in a room, but if her inner dialogue says, "I do not belong here," she will retreat. But if her inner dialogue says, "I am here because God sent me," she will rise. This kind of inner dialogue strengthens her in ways that external encouragement could never accomplish. Every destiny God designs for a woman requires her participation, not just through her actions, but through her agreement. An agreement starts in her mind. When she chooses to silence the voice of fear, rebuke the voice of doubt, and amplify the voice of truth, her inner dialogue becomes a catalyst for transformation. She begins to speak to herself like a woman who knows her value, her calling, and her God. And the moment her inner world aligns with heaven, her destiny begins to unfold in ways she never imagined. When God prepares to usher a woman into a new season, he does not start by changing what is around her. He starts by transforming what is within her.
A shift of season always requires a shift of mind. New seasons demand new thinking, new perspectives, new expectations,
and new levels of spiritual maturity. Before God elevates her, expands her, or blesses her,
he first adjusts her mindset so she can sustain what he is about to release.
A woman cannot step into a promised place while carrying the mindset of a past place. Her thoughts must rise to meet the future God is calling her into. Many women pray for God to open doors, but God loves them too much to open doors they are not mentally or emotionally prepared to walk through. A new season without a renewed mind becomes a burden instead of a blessing. If her thinking is still shaped by fear, insecurity, or old wounds, even divine opportunities can feel overwhelming. So God begins working on her inner world before he shifts her outer world. He challenges the beliefs that limit her, the fears that imprison her, the assumptions that sabotage her, and the narratives that contradict his promises. He dismantles mindsets that were built in survival season so she can grow into a purpose season. Sometimes the season is ready, but the woman is not. Not because she lacks talent or calling, but because her thoughts are still tied to what she used to be rather than who she is becoming. She may be praying for breakthrough while thinking like someone who is still bound. She may be asking for abundance while thinking with the scarcity mentality. She may be desiring new relationships while thinking with old insecurities. God knows that a woman cannot carry something new with a mind shaped by something old. So he starts by renewing her inner dialogue, reshaping her identity, and reorienting her thoughts so she can embrace what is ahead. A season shift requires her to see herself differently. She must see herself through the lens of divine purpose rather than personal history. She must rise above labels placed on her by others or by her past. If she enters a new season feeling unworthy, she will shrink. If she enters it feeling incapable, she will retreat. If she enters it expecting disappointment, she will misinterpret blessings as burdens. But when her mind shifts and she starts seeing herself as God sees her, she becomes aligned with the future he designed. God does not change her environment to convince her of her worth. He changes her mind so she can walk in that worth, regardless of her environment. This mental shift often begins with discomfort. God will allow situations that expose the limitations of her current mindset. He will let her outgrow certain patterns, relationships, or routines. He will make old ways of thinking feel too small for the woman she is becoming. She may find herself restless, stirred, or unable to stay comfortable in what once felt familiar. This is not confusion. It is divine disruption. God is stretching her capacity, enlarging her vision, and expanding her thinking. So when the new season arrives, she is mentally equipped to embrace it. Her mind must shift from fear to faith, from victimhood to victory, from hesitation to boldness, from excuses to execution, from overthinking to obedience, from self-doubt to God confidence. These mental shifts prepare her to walk boldly into the places God is calling her. Without these shifts, she may sabotage her own blessings, misinterpret God's timing, or settle for less because she cannot imagine more. But when her mind transforms, her decisions, habits, and posture transform with it, and she becomes a match for the season God is releasing. There are blessings waiting for her that require a renewed mindset. There are opportunities waiting that require her to think differently about who she is, what she carries, and what she is capable of. Her future requires a stronger, wiser, more confident version of herself. And that version is being formed in her mind long before it appears in her surroundings. God is preparing her internally for what he will reveal externally.
When her thoughts shift, heaven responds.
When her mind elevates, doors open. When her thinking aligns with God's vision, her season cannot remain the same. God prepares a woman for a greater blessing. He often begins by dealing with the language she uses to describe her pain. Old wounds carry old words, words spoken in fear, disappointment, betrayal, or confusion. These words linger long after the moment has passed, shaping identity, expectations, and decisions. A woman may move on physically, but if she still speaks the vocabulary of her wounds, She remains emotionally anchored to a place she no longer lives. God knows that for her to walk into the fullness of what he has prepared, she must learn to give new words to old wounds. Not to deny what happened, but to redefine it. Not to erase her history, but to reclaim her narrative. Old wounds speak loudly until new words silence them. A broken heart whispers, you're not enough. A betrayal murmurs, you can't trust again. A loss sighs, nothing good lasts. These whispers become internal scripts that repeat without permission, affecting how she loves, how she dreams, and even how she prays. God does not ignore these wounds. He confronts them with truth. He begins to teach her a new language, a language of healing, identity, and restoration. He invites her to speak life into places where pain once spoke death. He guides her to declare strength where weakness once had a voice. He leads her to proclaim hope where despair used to dominate. New words become the bridge between who she was and who she is becoming. To heal her wounds, God must first heal her words. Sometimes the deepest wound is not what happened to her, but what she concluded about herself because of what happened. A wound might tell her that she is unworthy of love, but God gives her new words that say she is fearfully and wonderfully made. A wound might tell her she is abandoned, but God gives her new words that say she is chosen and never alone. A wound might tell her life is unpredictable and unsafe, but God gives her words of peace and promise. As she begins to speak these truths over herself, the atmosphere within her shifts. Pain loses its authority when truth takes its place. God is not asking her to pretend her wounds never existed. He is inviting her to stop letting those wounds write her future. Every word she speaks becomes a seed, and the harvest of her life grows from the vocabulary she nurtures. Old wounds produce bitter seeds when she rehearses the language of anger or fear. But when she sows new words, words of hope, forgiveness, faith, and restoration, she begins to harvest strength from the very places that once weakened her. Her blessing requires this shift because blessings bloom best in healed soil. A heart full of bitterness cannot carry the weight of new joy. A mind trapped in old narratives cannot perceive new opportunities. A soul bound by old labels cannot step into new identity. New words also change how she interprets her past. What once felt like failure begins to look like preparation. What once felt like rejection becomes redirection. What once felt like loss becomes the seedbed for resilience. She realizes that new words do not change history, but they change the meaning of history. And when the meaning changes, the power of the wound diminishes. This is why God teaches her to speak differently. Because the moment her words shift, her perception shifts. And when her perception shifts, her future expands. Healing often begins in the mouth before it flows into the heart. A woman who continually speaks her pain keeps her wounds open. A woman who learns to speak healing invites God into the scar. Old words hold her captive. New words set her free. This freedom is not instant, it is practiced. She must choose new words daily, sometimes hourly. She must interrupt old patterns with deliberate truth. She must confront memories with declarations of who she now is, not who she was when the wound occurred. This discipline builds spiritual muscle, emotional strength, and mental clarity. Her blessing requires this transformation because blessings demand capacity. God cannot pour new joy into a heart full of old grief that has never been released. He cannot place new opportunities on a woman who still speaks like she is unworthy of them. He cannot elevate a woman whose words keep her anchored to the ground. So he teaches her to align her speech with his promise. As she learns to speak new words, she becomes a new woman, one capable of carrying the blessing she once prayed for. When a woman stands on the edge of her breakthrough, One of the greatest shifts God brings into her life is the transformation of her inner voice. Many women carry an internal dialogue that constantly apologizes.
Apologizing for taking up space, apologizing for wanting more, apologizing for having dreams, apologizing for their strength, apologizing for their voice, their calling, their gifting, their resilience.
This apologetic mentality becomes a quiet prison, convincing her to shrink when she should be rising, to retreat when she should be stepping forward, to dim her light when she was created to shine. But breakthrough comes the moment her inner voice stops apologizing, the moment she stops feeling guilty for becoming the woman God ordained her to be.
This shift does not happen overnight. It begins when God confronts the timid language she has used to negotiate her worth. Somewhere along the journey, she learned to make herself smaller so others could feel comfortable. She learned to silence her opinions to avoid conflict. She learned to downplay her gifts because someone envied them. She learned to apologize for her existence because someone made her feel like too much or not enough.
These patterns become embedded in her inner dialogue until she believes humility means hiding. But God never asked her to hide. God never asked her to shrink. God never asked her to apologize for being who He designed her to be. He created her with intentionality, purpose, and boldness. And her breakthrough begins when she finally agrees with Him. An apologizing inner voice is rooted in fear. Fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of failing, fear of succeeding, fear of being misunderstood. Fear whispers, you're too strong, you're too emotional, you're too ambitious, you're too gifted, you're too loud, or sometimes you're not enough. But God replaces these whispers with truth. He begins to shift her inner voice from fear to confidence, from doubt to faith, from insecurity to identity. This new voice does not emerge through pride, but through clarity. Clarity about who she is and who she is not. About what God has assigned her to do. Clarity about the fact that she does not need to apologize for being chosen, called, or crafted with intention.
As her inner voice grows stronger, she begins to recognize how many opportunities she forfeited because she was trying to stay small. She remembers times she dimmed her brilliance to make others comfortable.
She recalls moments she said sorry when she should have said yes. She sees the places where her destiny was delayed, not because she lacked capability, but because she apologized her way out of what God had already approved. But the beautiful truth is that God never lets a surrendered woman miss what belongs to her. He begins to reintroduce her to her own power. He teaches her to speak to herself with authority. He reminds her that being confident is not arrogance. Confidence is agreement with God. When her inner voice stops apologizing, she starts walking differently. She stops seeking permission to be herself. She stops shrinking from opportunities. She stops explaining why she deserves to be in the room. She stops overthinking her worth. She stops asking for validation from people who could never comprehend her calling. Her steps become more aligned, her decisions become more intentional, and her spirit becomes more anchored.
A woman who no longer apologizes for her identity becomes a woman who walks boldly into breakthrough.
This shift also changes how she sets boundaries. An apologizing inner voice leads her to tolerate what hurts her because she doesn't want to upset anyone. It convinces her to carry burdens that aren't hers because she feels obligated. But when the apology fades from her inner dialogue, she learns to say no without guilt, enough without fear, and this is not my assignment without shame. Her breakthrough requires boundaries, and God strengthens her inner voice to build them. A non-apologizing inner voice also unlocks her creativity, purpose, and vision. She starts dreaming again without second-guessing herself. She starts planning without apologizing for having ambition. She starts speaking without rehearsing how others will perceive her. She starts believing that her presence is not an accident, it is a divine placement. Her ideas flow with clarity, her spirit becomes lighter, and her purpose becomes unmistakable. The The woman who once apologized for her strength now uses it. The woman who once apologized for her calling now embraces it. The woman who once apologized for her voice now speaks with conviction. The woman who once apologized for her dreams now pursues them boldly. And the moment she stops apologizing internally is the same moment she steps into the breakthrough God prepared for her. When God prepares to release a great blessing over a woman's life, he does not begin by enlarging her circumstances. He begins by enlarging her belief. A blessing too big requires a mindset that is willing to stretch, expand, and rise to meet what God is about to pour out. Many women pray for more, but still think in the language of less. They desire overflow while holding the mindset of scarcity. They expect miracles, but imagine them only in miniature form. Yet every great blessing God gives demands a woman who can believe beyond her current sight, beyond her past limits, and beyond her natural logic. Her blessing requires her to believe bigger, because heaven only releases what faith has room to receive. Believing bigger does not mean ignoring the realities of life. It means refusing to let those realities define the boundaries of possibility. God often calls a woman into a place where her natural ability feels too small, her resources feel inadequate, and her experience seems insufficient. Not to shame her, but to stretch her. He positions her in situations that require faith bigger than what she has ever practiced. The old level of belief cannot unlock new levels of destiny. A great blessing needs a great capacity, and capacity is built in the unseen stretches of the heart and mind. God grows her belief the way a gardener prepares soil, by breaking it open so something new can be planted. Sometimes the greatest obstacle to believing bigger is not fear, but familiarity. A woman becomes used to certain patterns of disappointment, certain cycles of lack, certain rhythms of survival. She becomes so accustomed to making do with little that she stops imagining abundance altogether. Survival becomes her default expectation. But God did not create her for perpetual survival. He designed her for purpose, growth, and flourishing. So he begins to disrupt her comfort zone. He plants desires in her heart that feel too large to explain. He whispers visions into her spirit that contradict the limits of her environment. He stirs an inner restlessness that refuses to let her settle for mediocrity. These divine nudges are not random. They're invitations to believe bigger.
Believing bigger requires her to stop measuring her future by the scale of her past.
What happened before does not determine what God can do now. Where she struggled then does not define where she will thrive next. The doors that closed previously were not indicators of failure. They were preparations for something greater. Yet if she keeps her faith boxed inside the parameters of old disappointments, she will resist the new doors God is opening. Believing bigger requires her to look at her past without letting it place limits on her expectations. She must allow God to rewrite her perspective so her faith can grow beyond the boundaries of yesterday. To believe bigger, she must also confront inner narratives that whisper smallness. Narratives that say, be realistic, don't expect too much, or people like you don't get those kinds of opportunities. These are not just doubts, they are spiritual ceilings. As long as these ceilings remain unchallenged, her faith cannot rise. God begins to dismantle these beliefs by reminding her of who she is in him, a daughter of purpose, a vessel of promise, a woman crafted in his image and empowered by his spirit. When she learns to speak to herself from this identity, her belief begins to expand. She starts expecting doors to open. She starts expecting answers to come. She starts expecting provision to meet her needs. Faith becomes her default posture. posture, not her last resort. Believing bigger also requires her to step beyond the safety of logic. Logic is not the enemy, but logic alone cannot produce miracles. There are blessings God wants to release that do not make sense on paper. Promises that cannot be explained by resources. Opportunities that cannot be predicted by statistics. When she relies only on what she can calculate, she shrinks her belief to the size of her own ability. But great blessings require her to trust in God's ability, which far exceeds her own. She must learn to step into places where the ground appears unsteady, trusting that God will steady it beneath her feet. She must learn to walk by faith, even when she cannot see the full path. As her belief grows, her actions begin to change. She applies for opportunities she once disqualified herself from. She pursues dreams she once dismissed. She speaks with confidence she once buried. She prepares for blessings she cannot yet see, trusting that preparation is a form of faith. She takes steps that stretch her, decisions that challenge her, and leaps that push her into unfamiliar territory. Believing bigger transforms her posture, her choices, and her courage. The more her belief expands, the more room she creates for God to move.
She begins to realize that the size of her blessing is not limited by God's power, but by her willingness to receive. When she believes bigger, heaven responds. When she believes bigger, doors open that were once inaccessible. When she believes bigger, blessings find their way to her because her faith finally has the capacity to hold them.